Hi, I'm Shane.
And I'm Alex.
And this is the RPM Podcast.
And for one final time this season, Shane and I will discuss a race weekend, the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. Now, this probably wasn't the blockbuster finish to the season that we might have all hoped for, but there's still quite a lot to go over, and we will certainly do that. Now, View from the Stands was pretty packed last week. This week, we did get a question from Dave Doherty about our driver of the season. Now, we're going to cover that sort of thing in a special end-of-season report video, which will be coming soon after this one is out. So keep an eye out for that, basically. So we'll just go straight to the race.
Yes, so before the race, we had quite an interesting qualifying session, didn't we? And by interesting, it wasn't the normal proceedings. So let's take a dive into that. Obviously, the top three being Verstappen, Bottas and Hamilton. Now, if you had said to me, who do you think will qualify first in this race? I think everyone would agree saying Hamilton was probably the favourite. He's very experienced around this track. He's done it. He's got pole position many times before. He's won this race many times before. It's one of his favourite tracks to drive, not necessarily for overtaking, etc. But Verstappen pulled it out the bag, just managed to hook up every single lap. And I remember listening to the commentary. Verstappen didn't have the fastest overall lap. Well, he did. That's why he finished pole position. But each sector wasn't the fastest sector. He was like second or third fastest in each sector. But the fact is that he managed to hook up all those second fastest sectors, create the fastest lap. Whereas Bottas and Hamilton would be, say, fastest in sector 1, but fifth fastest in sector 2, and just didn't manage to hook it up. So consistency from that Red Bull. And what a way to end the season as well. And what a way to show Mercedes that you've not given up. That Red Bull have come back and they've turned around and said, you know what, we're going to have pole position, and fair play to them. It was fantastic.
Yeah, Verstappen finally gets pole for the first time since Brazil 2019. It's a surprise to think that it's his third ever pole. Yeah, when you think of Max Verstappen, you sort of would probably think of more than 3 poles. But yeah, that's his third, and the first of the season, of course, not powered by Mercedes. So nice of them to break that. To break that particular record on the last race of the season. And Red Bull have shown an ability to keep fighting back to the end of the season. Trouble is, of course, is whether or not that deficit will be as small at the start of next season, because we've seen this big gap between them at the beginning, and then they slowly begin to close it over the course of the season because Mercedes stopped developing their car.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens next year. But great news for Red Bull and a great way to finish the season for them, or certainly at this point, great way for them to go into the race.
Absolutely. And another fantastic qualifying result from Norris. And I think P4 is his best qualifying yet, or matches his best qualifying yet. Puts on the second row next to Lewis Hamilton. Now, if you said, I'll keep on going back to if you had thought this or if you had thought that, but a couple of years ago, if you had said McLaren going to be, top of qualifying, running up next to the Mercedes, that's a huge achievement. And it just goes to show how far that team have come this year and last year, and how far they've developed that car. And it's only going to get better with that Mercedes engine coming in next year. McLaren Mercedes is back, and I look forward to seeing what that car can produce.
Well, it secures Norris's position over Sainz in their qualifying head-to-heads as well, 9-8. They are the closest out of all of them. Although I think Giovinazzi and Raikkonen are also 9-8 in Giovinazzi's favour.
Won that.
Which is great. So yeah, some interesting qualifying head-to-heads coming down to the wire at this point as well. There was a new livery for Mercedes. They kind of had a return to their old silver on the back, where it was listing a bunch of names of people who helped them get where they are, including Roscoe.
I saw that,
which is rather sweet. I quite like that livery with that sort of silver burst at the back. I thought it looked quite nice. As much as I love the black livery, and as mean as it is, it did provide a bit of shade, a bit of light and shade coverage on the car. It especially
looks good under the artificial spotlight, under the artificial lights, doesn't it? We've mentioned it in all those Bahrain. Cars do. It just, and like the McLaren does, like you said, every single car does it. They just look so much better under equal bright light and not the sunshine. Which is a nice change. We've had a couple of night races. I mean, Bahrain Bahrain is a night race. It's late in the evening, and Abu Dhabi starts off with some daylight, doesn't it? And then moves into the to the night as the race goes on.
Isn't it?
Yeah. I love it when we have tracks like that. It just really brings out the colours and makes you thankful for these car designers at how well they make their cars look. But back to qualifying, not really much else to comment apart from, Leclerc got into Q3, which is quite good for the Ferrari, whereas Vettel's down in P13, which is unfortunate.
Perez, Leclerc starts 12th, doesn't he, because of his penalty from the previous race.
Yep. And Perez obviously starting 15th, but didn't start. He started from the back of the grid as well, didn't he? He did because of his engine penalty. So I'm surprised he went out and qualified, but I guess if you've got a brand new engine in the back, you're not really wasting any, you're not got anything to be careful about, unlike some teams which were struggling through the race throughout their reliability.
Still potentially useful data. We also saw a good result for Kvyat, who outperformed Gasly once again.
Kvyat's been on
7th.
It's been on a roll the last couple of races. He's really come to light. He's really come to show what he can do. And I watched an interview of him, and he says it's a shame really because he's finally got working with the engineers. The engineers are understanding the car better and how Kvyat likes the car, and it's all finally come together in the last 3 or 4 races, which is fantastic because his driving has, he's moved up across the field. It's just too little, too late, unfortunately. I feel like for Kvyat because I don't think he'll be in that seat next year, which is a shame because going into this race we've got a lot of not a lot of unknowns, but we're saying goodbye to a couple of drivers: Kvyat, Kevin Magnussen, obviously Roman Grosjean, all leaving the sport. Not obviously Lewis hasn't signed yet, but we assume he's going to. Just a lot of changes. It was the end of an era. It felt like an end of an era. It felt like this should have been 2021, and this should have been the season before everything changes. This was such a good season.
Well, it was going to be originally.
Yeah, it was. And it was such a good season. It would have been nice to hit the reset button next year with all these new drivers. But obviously, we're going to have a bit of a holding year next year, as people keep on describing it. Another Mercedes 1-2. Or maybe not a Mercedes 1-2. You never know next year. Bottas only just got that this year. But we'll get onto that bit later on with the standings. But anything else to add on qualifying, Alex?
No, just, we covered our penalties here. So that was about it, really. Yeah, some good results for some of the midfield teams. As you say, they become more acquainted with the running of their cars and the running of their engines over the course of the season. So it's good to see some interesting qualifying head-to-heads in the midfield because of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that ready for lights out?
Yes, it's lights out. We're at Abu Dhabi, the last race of the season, and it's going to be an absolute corker. Max Verstappen's on pole with Bottas next to him, and Hamilton sat closely behind in P3. And it's lights out. And everyone, to my surprise, got a relatively good and clean start through Sector 1. Well, throughout the whole lap, really. I was just keeping an eye on. When I was writing this down, I thought, well, everyone's made it through Sector 1, so I won't put lap 1, I'll put Sector 1. But to note, Max got off to a really good start, and that surprised me, and I'm really happy for him because actually there's been a couple of times this year where Max has qualified in the top 4, got a really decent start, then that Honda engine has just not delivered what it needs to do, or there's been a gremlin, or he's been caught up in some kind of accident, going back to last week in Bahrain. Even he tried to avoid the incident, he ended up being, going into the wall. I thought this week it needs to be Max's week. Max needs a good, clean start, and then we'll see a massive battle between the Mercedes and Red Bull. So it was nice to see Max getting a good start. And not much really happened on the first lap. Like I mentioned, everyone got through pretty clean. Magnussen made up 3 places on that first lap, which was the biggest change of the first lap, which is relatively small given that some races we've seen drivers jump 7, 9 or 10 positions in one lap. And Abu Dhabi is quite a long lap as well. So I was expecting it to be a little bit more, but it's known for not being the best at overtaking, which surprises me given that you've got a couple of long straights. And after Max crosses the start-finish line going on to lap 2, he's 1.4 seconds ahead of Bottas.
Yeah, speaking of Bottas, we did see him have a little wobble in turn 1 at the very first bit, kind of similar to what he did to Bahrain as well. He just got a little bit squirrely coming out of the turn, but he managed to catch it. But it did mean that it was advantage for Verstappen going into the end of Sector 1. Also, interestingly, we saw all 3 tyre compounds start the race.
Yes.
So, don't often see that. So it was interesting that we were going to get eyes on potentially a whole bunch of different strategies. But yeah, coming out of the first lap, we had Verstappen already looking pretty strong ahead. You already mentioned Magnussen was the greatest of the gainers. Ricciardo managed to get past Vettel under the first lap. But then, then it was just kind of pretty static for the opening part of the race.
It was.
We had Perez making a few moves at the back. Obviously, he started at the back. But he was still 20th after lap 1. I think he had some kind of problem. Maybe he went wide somewhere or something. But
potentially, yeah.
I find it hard to believe he wasn't able to make up any places. So I think something must have gone wrong somewhere.
Yeah. All I've got over the first couple of laps is Gasly made a good overtake on Ocon on the DRS straight. Although DRS
they
wasn't
had a good little battle, didn't they?
Yeah, DRS wasn't enabled, so it was a clean, like, legit. I'm going to call it a legit overtake, and overtake's an overtake, but it was a non-DRS assisted overtake, which I love to see. Ocon tries to come back at him, but didn't quite make it through. And the beauty of this track is you've got one DRS straight, a quick chicane, and then if you've made the overtake, you're at a bit of a deficit going into the second straight because the person behind you then gets your DRS or gets the DRS what you've just had, and it almost balances out. But a couple of times this week, today we've seen cars make it work and defend going into that second DRS straight. Another thing I found quite interesting is Vettel and Leclerc. So Vettel was ahead of Leclerc for quite some time and was on the hard tyre, whereas Leclerc was on the medium. And I almost expected, I was waiting to hear, let Leclerc through. It would summarise Vettel's season if that was what came through on the radio. But actually, I don't think it ever came through on the radio, and they just let the guys race.
I don't know if he would have followed it, even if it had. What incentive has he got to do what they say?
Yeah, he's got nothing to lose, really, has he? Has Vettel? But to be fair to him, Leclerc picked up DRS on lap 3 and had it, for quite some time, and never really made the move. Had a look a couple of times, but never made the move stick. And Vettel just remained cool under pressure and just kept on defending. And if Vettel's learned anything this year, it's how to defend in that Ferrari, because unfortunately, instead of going forward this year, he's been going backwards most of the time. So maybe that, played into his hands, the 4-time world champion. It's crazy when you say that, isn't it? Vettel's a 4-time world champion. He's had such an abysmal year. Like, Ferrari have finished 6th in the constructors, but we'll touch on that later on. Just not been their year at all. Albon gets past Norris.
Compounded by their poor strategy in this race.
Yes.
And it's funny to see them running alongside those Alfa Romeos, their customer team. They were running alongside them in this race, especially in the closing stages. So, yeah, Vettel, I think he's still shown a few moments of his quality, but they've been maybe a little bit too few far in between, and definitely been outshone by Leclerc. So hopefully he can pick things back up a little bit.
Absolutely. And what I find interesting about the finishing positions of this race, or the constructor finishing positions, is if you didn't know that next year's pit lane order is based on obviously this year's results, constructors' results. So it will be Mercedes, Red Bull, McLaren, Racing Point, and Ferrari, who are usually so far up, the top end, usually in second or third at least, and now to be like down the other half of the field, like down the other end of the pit lane. It's going to be odd to see, and that's what when you're an F1 fan, when you can pinpoint what looks odd in the pit, in the lineup of the garages. But yeah, it's just been such an abysmal season for Ferrari, and I can't see it getting any better next year. They'll be pinning all their hopes on 2021, as will a lot of teams, to be fair. I'm sure Mercedes are looking forward to next year, but they're probably the only team who are looking forward to next year. But back to the race.
Ferrari seem confident about their engine, though. So
yes, exactly. Yep. Yeah. What's that for 2022 or 2021?
For next year, even.
Oh, okay. If
they seem confident about bringing it back a bit more. So
wonder what loophole they've found. No, I'm joking.
You never know. There must be one the FIA hasn't considered.
Well, DAS has now been banned, hasn't it? That was banned quite early on in the year for next year.
Yeah. Although it doesn't seem quite so shocking. So.
No, not at all. But I wonder if Mercedes have thought of any extra things to put on their car, because they are the go-to team when you think of how they've innovated Formula One over the last couple of years. They've been at the top of it, always bringing in new and wonderful things. But back to the race.
So you mentioned Albon getting past Norris. This was on lap 5 or 6.
Yep.
ended up in P4. Norris did try to fight back and did a really good job of defending. I think that Norris's defensive driving has really come a long way this season.
It really
He's got particularly good at it. Made good use of the DRS to try and fight back, but ultimately Albon held on to it going into turn 11, and we saw a lot of similar moves across the race like that. And good signs from Albon. I mean, he qualified okay. Obviously, he was behind Norris, who had a good lap. But this was good signs from Albon, who was making moves early on in the race. And, you've got a Red Bull on softs. You've got a McLaren on softs. It's Albon, though. I say somewhat carefully. But, yeah, that's exactly what we should be seeing from the Red Bull driver. As much as I don't want to see Norris getting overtaken, the reality of the situation is that Red Bull should be better, and Albon did what needed to be done and actually served far more efficiently as a rear gunner for Verstappen in this race.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. The Renault switched positions as well. Ocon was initially ahead of Ricciardo. They were on a different strategy. I love the radio message into Ocon's car. Do you have more pace? Yes, we'll use it. We laugh at that, but obviously the name of the game this race was tyre preservation. It was like how long you can let your tyres go for and how long they can last. So obviously Ocon was doing what needed to be done, but Ricciardo felt like he had more pace, and then they switched it, which is those happen, but those moves happen. But I'd rather see it be a authentic. If you want to get past your teammate, go ahead and get past him. But I can understand that at the end of the year, you're probably, especially with Renault in the position they were, gunning for as many points in the Constructors' Championship as possible. And it played out quite well because Daniel Ricciardo finished quite high today. He was running in 4th or 5th for quite a long time and managed to box and took it home in the top 10.
Yeah, he had a pretty good race, good first stint. He started on hards, so that was definitely helpful. And we've seen Ocon be the one to make the long run and to hold on to his tyres. So maybe expected something more from him at this stage. He was making some overtakes. This would have been after the safety car, because we had a moment with Perez, which we'll get to in a moment. But he was able to get past a few people after the safety car. But I expected him to do a bit better today, as he's known for holding onto his tyres, and the big stint aided a few drivers, not forgetting, of course, including his teammate. So probably a bit disappointing for Renault, and it was a tough weekend overall for them because they were struggling for pace during free practice, and qualifying was pretty underwhelming for them as well. So then neither car managed to get into Q3. It's not really what they want at the end of a season where they're supposed to have been developing. But let's go to Perez then. Unfortunately, despite the joy of last week, sadly, on what could potentially be his last race in Formula One, for at least a year, let's say. It's just some kind of transmission failure. We saw oil pressure problem being listed on the dash as he was coming to a stop. It just seems that he had a new engine, didn't he? He had a brand new engine, but something's gone pop. And on lap 10, that was it. Perez was out. He was making really good progress through the field. We saw him cutting past all of the back markers, and was hoping for an exciting battle between McLaren and Racing Point for those all-important championship points, but it wasn't to be.
You're correct. It wasn't, it wasn't to be at all, and it is a shame to see him break down, especially on his last lap. I think if you're leaving Formula One, you want to drive that car to the last possible lap if it's the last time you're going to be in a Formula One car, and it's just a shame that he went from the highs.
And he would have put in a banger as well. It would have been a good one.
It was gearing up to be a fantastic race for him, because he'd already made, I think he was in P15 or P14 at this point, and this is with the struggles he had on lap 1. So 10 laps into the race, he'd already cleared 25% of the field. Had a long way to go in this race. Had 55 laps to do what he needed to do with a fresh Mercedes engine in the back of that car. And after the positive vibes of last week, I had such high hopes, and it's nothing to do with the driver at all. But I was gunning for him. Like we've said, I'm a McLaren fan. You're a McLaren fan. I was keeping an eye on those points, but I was like, I would love to see Perez pick up a point or two coming from the back of the grid. That would really, it just shows good driving, good racing. It would have made the race a little bit more interesting. But Perez breaks down, and he, you could see the anger or like the frustration on his face. He just think he kicked something, which is fair enough. We've all done that kind of stuff before. But a virtual safety car was triggered, and then all the Mercedes fans just like stopped and looked, because Red Bull came in and they boxed Max. And then Mercedes, if you looked up on the graphic on the top left-hand side of your screen, both Bott and Ham had Pitt next to them. And I was thinking, here we go. What's going to happen? And they pulled it off. They pulled off a pretty good double stack, both less than 2.5 seconds. So pretty quick. For Mercedes as well, 2.5 seconds is their standard. So to achieve two pit stops within that time frame, really good double stack. And McLaren double stacked as well. We're taking advantage of the virtual safety car. Lance Stroll was released quite close to the McLaren. It was mentioned on the commentary, but to be fair, the McLaren didn't have to take any avoiding action, and neither did Lance Stroll. So it wasn't an unsafe release. It was just close. It's what happens when the virtual safety car comes out and you start boxing every single car underneath the sun. So the pit stops went relatively well. When did Carlos Sainz pit? Oh, of course, McLaren did a double pit stop. So Carlos Sainz was soon going to be under investigation. If you want to talk about that now, because it's around the pit stop area.
Yeah, there was some kind of supposed investigation going on for Sainz going too slowly or unnecessarily slowly in the pit lane. Possibly early on as he was coming in, he may have backed off slightly because of the double stack in order to ensure that he wasn't waiting, maybe. And then shortly after that, the stewards announced that they were going to investigate it after the race, which seems very strange to me given the amount of data that they have. And once again, we've seen what seems to be a pretty straightforward investigation. Could have been done there and then. Now, apparently they didn't do it there and then because they were waiting for some telemetry to be sent to them. Why they don't have access to that more or less immediately, I don't know. But apparently they didn't. They were waiting for something, so they say. But on the final race of the year, when that could be deciding the Constructors' Championship, why? Why couldn't they just do it as soon as they could, as soon as they got hold of that data? If it's coming from a team, for example, they should be in a position to say, send us that data, right now, because we need it to make a decision on the race. So I don't understand. I don't understand that at all, and I don't understand why it keeps happening. These are pretty simple decisions when you've got the amount of data that the stewards no doubt have access to. If it's a case of are you going fast enough or or not, that should be pretty open and shut. If you've got the onboards and you've got a little bit of the telemetry that they usually have access to pretty quickly. So yeah, not really good enough from the stewards on this.
No, I completely agree, and it baffled me more so because of the stakes which were being upheld. We've got McLaren which are fighting for P3, Racing Point which are fighting for P3. It was a discrepancy between those two teams. So why they didn't want to get that squared away as soon as possible to then let the teams react and race to whatever means necessary to get to secure those points. If it'd be a 5-second penalty or a 10-second penalty, they would have reacted differently. But why in the world would they want to do that result after the race? Imagine if Lance Stroll had finished a couple of seconds behind Carlos Sainz, and that was the difference between P3 and P4, and then you give Carlos Sainz a penalty, but you've decided that after the race. You've just decided between third and fourth in the Constructors' Championship. If that's gone to the line, if that's the situation, you need to decide it during the race. It should not be held for after the race. And like you said, telemetry, I did not buy that at all. I was like, surely the FIA have access to all this telemetry at the click of a button. And if not, get on the phone to McLaren and ask them to send it over. There's plenty of personnel in that garage. I appreciate they're all probably busy, but there's probably a whole team of people sat in the UK behind a computer, doing strategy, looking at telemetry, feeding information to Abu Dhabi. And yet they couldn't just request that data. Thankfully, it was no further action, which is even more bizarre because I expected it to be like a 5-second penalty if they were waiting to decide after the race or waiting to decide something. I thought, they might have merit. They'll have something to go on or they'll be questioning something. But the fact that it came out as no further action just says to me, why couldn't that be decided in the race? Like Carlos was under investigation on lap 17. It's a 55-lap race. We had over an hour and 10 minutes of racing after he was in investigation.
I can't imagine the stewards were that busy. Like there wasn't a whole lot to adjudicate on.
Exactly right, Alex. You're not wrong. Like there wasn't many overtakes to go wrong. It was just very bizarre. But it is what it is.
Steps just need to be taken to ensure that kind of information can be gathered a little bit more efficiently in future so that when it comes to important race results, we're not sat there going, well, why can't you just do it now? What's the hold up? And of course, we don't hear anything for another 20, 25 laps or even after the race, why they couldn't do it there and then. It just needs to be a little bit quicker. It's hard to imagine any other sport where a decision that could affect the entire outcome is just, blithely banded about and then put on the back burner until the actual result has come in. I mean, that just seems utterly bizarre. And it's not good enough in a sport where technology is everything.
I completely agree. And it's not like we're talking about 8th or 9th place in the championship. We're talking about 3rd place. We're talking about the top 3 positions. Who's scraped through to that top 3 position? Especially with Ferrari not being in a contender this year. Whatever team achieved that, it would have been massive for them. And to have that decision held over you until the end of the race and then some, I think the decision was made about an hour after the race or an hour and a half. McLaren were already celebrating, which is fair enough because they had such a big lead over the Ricciardo, I believe, was
which
up
only
behind
makes
him.
it more difficult for the stewards to then turn around and make a sort of potentially controversial decision. You would, wouldn't you? You would celebrate and all the rest of it. It's not a slight to McLaren, but I just don't get it. It just makes the decision that they're going to make even more inevitable. So why bother?
Yeah. Just if you've got something as minor as a slowing down in the pit lane and you've got the evidence, then just make a decision there and then. I just don't understand how they didn't have the tools at hand to make that decision. But we'll move on. I'll brush past the stewards and another strange decision or a strange methodology of making a decision. So
we ended up with a full safety car, didn't we?
Yes, yeah, we did.
On lap 11. I think there's possibly some oil on the track. Some of the drivers were reporting it. At this point, obviously, a lot of people had pitted. More people were going to pit. And we ended up with everybody on hards except for Leclerc, Giovinazzi and Raikkonen. Leclerc obviously on some kind of split strategy, trying to keep his mediums going. And then the safety car ended about lap 13. Fairly unremarkable start, really. Verstappen managed to get away pretty well.
Done it again, didn't he?
Yeah, again, it was a little bit of concern because we've seen Verstappen just doesn't seem to have had much fortune in regards to his mechanical situation. Like he, as a driver, has done everything that he needs to do, but they've had so many problems that seem to come in at about the worst possible time. And also, no matter where he finishes, it feels like we never get to see him properly race anyone. We want to see Max Verstappen really fighting someone for position, but whether he ends up DNFing at some point or he ends up on the podium as he consistently has, or even when he's leading the race, he's just on his own. He's in his own little bubble doing his own thing.
Well, he got a slam dunk this weekend, didn't he? What was it? Started pole position, led every single race, fastest lap and finished first. I think. Well, he
didn't get the fastest lap because Ricciardo nicked that at the end.
You're right. Yeah.
So no Grand Chelem or whatever it is,
whatever they call it.
But yeah, so that was after the safety car. Verstappen holds on pretty soundly, and then one thing I've got on here on my notes for shortly after that is it interestingly being broadcast that Vettel was getting some encouragement from his engineer.
I know.
Who was saying, you're doing really well, you're doing a good job. And he was in a pretty good position. He was in P7 at that point, and he was holding on to his tyres. And this was literally just before he got passed by Sainz. So.
Yep. Yeah, and got passed by a couple of people. But it was a strange broadcast. I wasn't sure what I was expecting.
Pointed, one might say.
Yes, almost pointed, given that it was his last race at Ferrari. But it was good to see some positive encouragement over the radio. Usually we hear people complain or people to go faster, but to hear just
silence.
That's
what we heard a lot of at the beginning of the season, wasn't it? Just a lot of silence.
Blimey, yeah. When they radioed, what are you talking about? When they radioed Vettel and you just heard nothing in return. It was just...
Yeah, he did it a couple of times, I think.
He did do it a couple of times. Sorry, I've just hit the mic. It just goes to show how that team has really struggled this year and the dynamics they've created. I think Vettel will be very happy today stepping out of that car and having a fresh start going into Aston Martin racing next year, which I can't wait to see how that team does. I'm generally excited to just see how that team does, with all that extra money, Vettel in a different car against Stroll. It's going to be career making for one of them. for sure. It will make one of their careers. If Lance does well, then he's beating a 4-time world champion, and if Vettel does well, then he's a 4-time world champion on the rise again. So you never know how it's going to go, but I'm very excited for it. Speaking of Lance Stroll, that's a bit later on in the race, but he does make a mistake eventually, and then loses time behind Vettel. I kept an eye on the racing points this week, like we all did against the McLarens, and that was almost the highlights of the remaining 40 laps. We've had a couple of overtakes, but it was definitely interesting to see how those two teams played out.
Yeah, we end up in a bit of a middle section of the race where especially nothing is happening. I don't know about you, but I was kind of just sort of watching the race and kind of letting it wash over me. We have a few overtakes. Gasly was doing particularly well during the middle section of this race. He started 9th, I think. He qualified 10th, wasn't he? Because he was last in Q3, but he started 9th because of penalties. Leclerc, that's right, yeah. But he was doing really well at this stage. He was making quite a few overtakes, including past his teammate earlier on that we saw for P8. Yep. I ended up getting past both Ferraris and Stroll as well, which was bad news for Stroll. This was a bit later on, about sort of lap 20, late lap 20s. But Stroll, who is now the last remaining Pink Panther, needing to bring home a solid haul of points in order to maintain that position, ends up getting passed by an AlphaTauri. And as you mentioned, was struggling and trying to catch up to, I think it was Vettel he was behind at the time he was trying to catch, was it?
Yes, it was. And I think what Stroll needed to do was finish in 7th or 8th, around 7th, because actually Racing Point had a significant lead. Well, not a significant lead, but had a hefty lead going into this race.
10 points, wasn't it? Something like that?
Yep. And with McLaren did very well to do what they did this race. They positioned their cars beautifully and managed to secure, is it P4 and P5 at the end? I think it was, wasn't it? 5th and 6th. So they did everything they needed to do. And the pressure was on more McLaren than it was Racing Point. All Racing Point had to do was secure, 4 or 5 points, and they would have won. They would have come third in the constructors, even with McLaren where they were. But it just wasn't to be. So I don't know if that Stroll. I don't know if he just felt the pressure, because the car should have been there. It really should have been. But he was being, especially towards the end of the race, he was being overtaken quite a bit. He managed to I can't remember where he finished. Was it 9th or 10th?
I think he ended up 9th at the end. No, he was 10th.
He was 10th, so he managed to scrape
Ocon
1
got
point.
Past, yeah.
Which is just, it was a bit underwhelming for Stroll, to be honest, in such a high pressure race. And I was just wondering if he struggled with it, whether that mental challenge got the most of him. Because he made a mistake behind Vettel. I mentioned on lap 26, he started sliding about and, had a little off behind Sebastian Vettel, which, didn't help their chances at all.
I feel like Racing Point have been a little bit tight-lipped about the development of their car over the course of the season too, because they were surrounded by controversy at the beginning, of course, because of, the tracing point and all this sort of stuff.
Yep.
And then there was signs that around, I think it was probably the Tuscan Grand Prix, they started to diverge somewhat from the original kind of just copy of the W10, where they started to adapt some of the parts to a more original design. And then kind of heard nothing since then. A lot of the cars we've heard a little bit about their development or how they're catching up or how they're sort of obviously improving on where they were. Like Renault, for example, who have made huge strides over the course of the season in general. But yeah, something about Racing Point's development has seemed a little bit unclear. Sometimes it looks like one of the fastest cars on track. And then other time,
it looks
Stroll,
terrible.
Stroll's, I think, is a good driver. Like, he's shown that he's got his quality. I mean, this is a guy who's managed to get on the podium a couple of times and has held his nerve. He's not like the best driver on track, but he's definitely shown a lot of maturity and quality as a young driver. So it does seem quite odd that at a track where it feels like he should have been much stronger, especially than the two McLarens, you'd think. I mean, in previous races, they clearly had the pace over them. It didn't translate. And then he ended up behind Vettel, of all people, and was struggling. So
yeah, it's strange when you look at it, because sometimes, like you said, Racing Point are the best of the rest. And McLaren seemingly have dropped off the pace and are fighting for a single point. And then the next week, it'll be the complete opposite way. McLaren are fighting for 4th and 5th or 5th and 6th, getting some really solid points. And Racing Point are seemingly nowhere. Like, maybe their car like specifications are completely opposite to one another. What one car does well at one track, the other car just seemingly can't achieve.
We also have more information about the development of McLaren because we know that they have entered some new components in order to conform to the homologation period, and they're developing parts in relation to the Mercedes engine that they will have next season.
Yes.
So we do know that they have some struggle with certain parts of the car that are not fully optimized and are more geared towards what they're going to do with their car next year. So we have a little bit of information of how things might have moved around throughout the season, but Racing Point, I don't know, it almost seems like a big mystery. Maybe I'm not reading my information in the right places.
No, I think you're right, but let's not forget that Racing Point actually got stung. They lost some championship points early on in the year.
That's true.
So maybe by doing so well, and actually they weren't gloating at all, but they were clearly very impressive in preseason testing and the first couple of the races. They're very proud. It was a very proud moment for the team. They had like turned their luck around, or made some serious gains. And then as that penalty, was it 15 points? I think they lost.
Yeah,
15 points. Didn't seem like a lot at the time, but looking at it now, they would have secured third place. So maybe that's why they're not talking about their development, because it's been the source of their controversy this year. Whether it been that they were so good at the beginning of the year, but they received so much negativity, like you said, the Racing Point, the pink Mercedes, all these names. Maybe they've just decided that, that let's not mention anything about the development of the car because we'll only bring back that criticism. It will only be highlighted again.
You allow your opponents to control the narrative.
Absolutely. So if you don't say anything, then there's nothing to control.
Yeah, definitely.
But it'd be interesting to see what goes on to next year, whether they maintain that. Obviously, they'll maintain that partnership with Mercedes. They're still going to be using Mercedes engines, but whether we'll see any more similarities between the two cars going forward, just don't know, because it clearly worked. But is it worth the risk?
It'd be interesting to find out.
Teams have done worse before.
Yeah, yeah,
exactly
that's true.
that. So where do we get to on the race then? What lap are we on? I think we're around midpoint, aren't we?
Yeah, we're kind of at the middle of the race, and we were talking.
Which kind of blows into the end.
Gasly. Yeah, there's just not this middle section of the race. There's just not a whole lot to talk about, really. This track, even though there's overtaking opportunities, you'd think with long straights, it just doesn't. And we mentioned it before when we talked about our tracks that we'd like to see in or out of Formula One. And the biggest problem with this track is just Sector 3. It's just utterly pointless. It just serves no purpose. It's a really long lap already. Why not just have a shorter Sector 3, something that's a little bit more flowing? There's just too many right angles. It's totally flat. There's no overtaking opportunities. Like, why is it there? It just feels like the whole purpose of that sector is to have the bit where we go under the fancy structure and look, there's some yachts. Like, who cares?
Yeah.
If they show me a good track.
If they opened up the last couple of corners for more of a sweeping turn, then you'd promote some overtaking going in down the pitch straight. That would have been amazing, because you've opened up those two corners, go flat out through there or near flat out, get a little bit more speed going to that first left-hander. There's an overtaking opportunity there, but it just, like you said, it was almost designed to be a spectacle for the venue, but not necessarily the racing. Don't get me wrong, I think it's a good looking track, and I think we can all agree it looks fantastic under the lights and the fireworks and the display they put on and the hotel right next to Ferrari World. But let's just get rid of it for the end of the season. Like, it was arguably, and I don't want to get any criticism here, but by all means, if you disagree with me, then pop it in the comments if you're watching on YouTube. That was probably the most boring race of the year, which is fantastic for the sport. Don't get me wrong, that we've had so many entertaining races this year. And
I think I'd put Spain ahead of that one.
Did we have Spain this year? I can't remember.
Yeah,
we did. It was before we started the podcast, wasn't it? But yeah, it's not a track I want to see at the end of the year. Put it in like the middle of the year or towards the end. But Brazil, make that the last race. And it's just something with a little bit more overtaking.
Almost anything else,
apart from France, but something with a little bit more character to promote the end of the season and make us think, wow, this is F1. This is what we're going to miss for 3 months. I can't wait until next year. Because after that race, I was like, oh, well, that's Formula One done now for 3 months. It just doesn't gear you up for the next season. You want an exciting race. And I know you can't always have them, but you want an exciting race at the end of the year to make you go, cannot wait for next year's Formula One. It's going to be amazing. This.
Yeah, I think it just needs a tweak in Sector 3. Just change Sector 3 if they can. I mean, they got all the money under the sun. I'm sure they could easily change it and just make
it's
it
not
a bit
poor
more
country,
interesting.
is it?
It can't possibly be good, because surely part of it, obviously, is they want to promote the UAE and they want to, promote its place globally. And that,
Yeah.
I guess that has more to it than simply the racing, because obviously it's to do with all of the partners and the corporate sponsors and the like. But amongst the fans and a lot of the viewership and journalists and blimey, even the commentators were commenting on it.
They were really struggling.
It's
weren't
not
they?
a good look, is it? Because it's just not a very good track, like in terms of its racing quality. And I think it's just largely down to Sector 3. I think the Sector 1's kind of cool. Sector 2 is basically just the two big straights.
Yeah.
And I think it is interesting that you've got this one really long straight with a DRS zone, but then you can come back in the next one if you get that exit out of what must be turn 8 and 9. If you can get that right, then yeah, you can kind of get back, and there's an opportunity for a bit of toing and froing there. But then you get into Sector 3 and just nothing happens.
It's just you just follow each other through Sector 3. There's no overtaking opportunities whatsoever. Yeah.
Just come up with you've got all the money you could possibly ask for. Just do something interesting with Sector 3, and it could be quite a good track.
Yeah.
But yeah, maybe as it works as the season exit, because you don't have a super bombastic race, and then you're not too bothered about the fact that you've got to wait for Formula One again. Maybe
I'm always bothered at the fact
silver-lined way of.
Yeah,
I know what you
mean.
mean. It's a possible silver lining to take from it. At least it's a subdued ending, so we can have a relaxed feeling going into the off season, maybe.
Yeah.
But
that's what I'm looking at.
Trying to see the positive.
Trying to scrape a positive out of a boring race.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't really have much to say about the racing up until like the closing stages of the race, to be honest.
I don't have anything past lap 40, and that's when Ricciardo came in after his mega stint on those tyres and switched out for a set of mediums, which works well for Ricciardo, put him back in the points. He came out in the points, which was great. I expected him to be a little bit faster with a fresh set of mediums on. I thought he would have caught up to the McLarens, but it just wasn't to be, which is fine because I didn't want the McLaren to lose any more points. With the potential penalty looming, I wanted to make sure they secured P3, being a McLaren fan. But I expected Ricciardo to be a little bit more pacey on those mediums. Wasn't to come, but we know what that Renault's like. It has, like you mentioned, it has struggled all weekend. So maybe I was just hoping for anything really. And given that was the only thing happening on track at the time, that was what I was gunning for.
He was doing a good job to keep Norris at arm's length during the earlier stages. Obviously, being on his older tyres, so he had he had Norris and Sainz behind him, who had pitted under the virtual safety car on fresher tyres. He managed to keep Norris out of DRS range, and he set his fastest lap on lap 32, despite the fact that he was coming to the end of his tyre life. So he was doing really well there, and pitted lap 40 and had put in a good enough stint that he came out P7 with 15 laps to go. And then after that, we enter the closing stages. Let's just briefly mention Leclerc, because there was a little bit of uncertainty about whether or not he should have been shown a black and white flag a little bit earlier. He had quite a few warnings for track limits and had a few laps deleted. I understand that it had been displayed somewhere, 2 penalties had been displayed where it was actually 1. And there was some kind of supposed issue with the timesheet where he'd basically been shown with multiple warnings where it had only actually been 1 registered by the stewards. Now, I guess it's easy and exciting to call conspiracy on this and that they're favouring Leclerc. And, whether or not there's any truth to that, I'm more interested on whether or not there's any evidence for him having done more track extending than he was actually penalised for, because there's plenty of camera angles. We've got all the onboards. Yeah. Maybe somebody will upload a video in the coming days and say, look, here's a video of Leclerc breaking track limits at the last turn 5 times, so he should have got a penalty. But I haven't seen it yet. So all we do know is that he was finally shown the black and white flag on lap 47 and presumably didn't do it again after that. So as I understand it, it seems that, I don't know, lack of evidence of there not being a conspiracy is not evidence. What I would like to see evidence of is him actually doing breaking the track limits more times than he should have done. So
yeah, and like you said, I'm sure there's a video
judgment
out there
on that one.
I'm sure by the time we finish this podcast, there'll be a video somewhere on the internet of like a lap by lap comparison of how far he went over that white line or how many times he should have been shown it. If he indeed did. I know a couple of the onboards we watched, he was still on the black and white, the red and white curb, but that was deemed as track extending this week. Whereas previous weeks, the curb was included in the track. It's all confusing. Like that definitely needs to be ironed out going into next year. It's either the curb or the white line, and keep it consistent week to week. Let's not change it wherever we go.
So they were watching it there. Was there any other places they were watching for track limits, or was that a last turn? And I don't think there was any others
because they were going quite wide. Coming out of the tunnel on the left-hander, they were going quite close to the wall, which they always have done every single year. They always go quite wide on the right-hand side to maximise the exit
fly over
speed.
that curb on the left-hand side.
Yeah. But apart from that, I don't think there was any other track limit corners. I can't imagine a great deal of time being gained. They're still riding a curb. It was still not the smoothest part of the track, but whatever they deem necessary.
So they have, with 10 laps to go, in fact, this was kind of the case a little bit earlier as well, I believe, but it's when I've written it on here, we have Alex Albon as the fastest man on track. And we mentioned briefly earlier that he was putting in a much better stint as the Red Bull rear gunner. But at this point, he'd really found the pace. Hamilton seemed to be struggling a little bit. They both Mercedes had boxed for hards under the VSC, so they'd been out especially long on those tyres. That would have been about 40 laps at least by that point. And Albon, the fastest man on track at this point, and gaining on Lewis Hamilton. And there was a slight possibility that he might catch him before the end. I did think that it was too great a deficit, and for what there is to say about Albon, he didn't strike me as suddenly pulling out enough pace to close that kind of gap. It was about 9 seconds.
And then overtake Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah, it's a tall ask, but it's something a little bit positive to close off the season for Albon in that he was having enough pace to actually catch up with those top three. So that was a possible glimmer of excitement for the final stages of the race.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been some times this year where Albon's been lapped by the lead car. A lot of cars.
He was doing the lapping this time.
He was doing the lapping, and to only finish just under 20 seconds behind his teammate over a 55 lap race, and it's quite a long lap. It's not a bad thing at all. Sorry for stuttering there, but it was not a bad thing at all. And he only finished a second and a half behind Hamilton. And we always say this, but if there was another 5 laps, I wonder what would have happened. But there isn't.
There wasn't another 5 laps.
There is never going to be another 5 laps. The laps are predetermined. Stop wishing for more laps. If they can't achieve it in those laps, they're probably not going to achieve it at all because they're working towards the end of the race. He was pushing at a pace where he would have enough tyre life, enough fuel, enough, battery for the end of the race. If there'd been another 5 laps, he would have done he would have probably moved up the same amount. He probably would have still finished a second and a half behind Hamilton, but he would have done it over 10 laps instead of over the 5 laps. But nevertheless,
we know what keeps happening when he gets into a tangle with Hamilton.
Yeah, exactly. Hamilton
maybe it was a good thing he didn't catch him.
yeah. We don't want to see that for the 4th time this year, maybe.
Something like that.
Not necessarily this year, but over the last couple of years. But Albon, we've given him some criticism this year, and I'm not going to apologise for it because he's put in some poor performances like other drivers have. But actually, this is one of the weeks where he's done quite a good job, and he should be proud going into the off season, and hopefully for him and the Red Bull, junior program, he keeps his seat going into next year. I believe we'll find out over the next week. Ted Kravitz reported on the notebook that we'll find out what's going on with that Red Bull seat and whether Perez will end up in it or not. There's rumours flying around everywhere. So if you want hard facts, go follow us on Twitter at RacePerMinute because we don't speculate. We basically produce a lot of facts when they come out, and we run quite a few polls. So we get opinionated polls, and we obviously just report on the facts. We don't like rumours because it's just doesn't do anything for us. Like there's no point saying, oh, Perez might be going to Red Bull. Perez might be going to Mercedes. That seat hasn't been filled yet. Perez could be going anywhere, but he's not.
But the risk is that it's easy to repeat them.
Yeah,
but
of course.
What always happens is, and I'm sure you do the same, whenever I see them, I always try and dig down to what the source of that information is.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And it always ends up being it's just somebody speculating on some website, which has been repeated by somebody else, which has been repeated by somebody else in another language usually. And then they go, look, this source from whatever country is reporting it here. And so, this
must
is
be true.
Possible rumor, possible speculation. An insider or, some unknown source. It's not enough for me. It's not enough to report it as even possible information because there's no difference between that and us simply coming up with our own speculations, as far as I'm concerned.
And sometimes when I look through Twitter and think, oh, someone's just tweeted that Perez is going to Red Bull, so I click on that tweet and find out what their source is, and they've retweeted something, and then I go through that retweet and then find out what that retweet was, and then all it turns out to be is someone like me or you who's got a little bit of a following going, oh, I've heard Perez is going to Red Bull, and we'll find us out on Tuesday.
It's always I'm hearing whispers.
Yeah, I'm hearing whispers.
I'm hearing this. That doesn't mean anything.
If you don't have a link to it at all, or anything like that, what can you do? It's
the same thing as the tweet, but somebody just mentioned it in speculation in passing in real life instead.
Absolutely,
it's exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
But so that's I like that we do the polls instead, because at least then that's how do you feel about it? What do you think will happen? Just out of curiosity. But we're not. I would never want to start pandering to the speculation. So
it's not what we're about.
We'll always try and just post what has actually been reported as much as possible.
Yeah. Should we move on to the final stages of the race? I think we've covered everything up until it. There's not much else to go on.
Yeah, at the very end, it's just we mentioned Albon closing up on Hamilton, and then we have Ricciardo stealing Max's fastest lap on the last lap.
Typical Ricciardo, right?
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny that he's done that to his former teammate who was looking for those extra points to potentially catch up to Bottas. And Ricciardo wanted the extra points as well to try and get up into fourth, what with Perez DNFing, but
of course,
that obviously wasn't to be either.
Yeah.
And we also saw some good defending from Raikkonen against Leclerc. This was only for P12, but this was about lap 42, and it showed his experience. He's probably learnt how to defend quite well, generally being the front man for Alfa Romeo as they battle in the lower third of the pack. So saw some interesting defending from Raikkonen, but other than that, it's Max Verstappen crosses the line after a pretty flawless performance almost all weekend. With
a hefty lead as well. I think it was 11 seconds he crossed the line with, which
just kept going further, didn't he?
Just kept on going. And the safety car came out 10 laps, just over 10 laps into the race. So they knocked out that 3-4 second lead he had, and he had to do it all over again. So to finish the race with 11-second lead over the both Mercedes is very good achievement for the Red Bulls.
It's 15.9 seconds to Bottas and 18.4 to Lewis Hamilton.
Well, there you go. That's
with Alex Albon nearly just under 20 seconds behind.
That's a reason to be proud. That's a reason to be proud. A minute to Norris.
Yeah, that's a great result.
Yeah, absolutely. Bottas in P2, Hamilton in P3, and then Albon in P4, all within 20 seconds of each other. And then, like you said, Norris in P5. Really good result for Norris. 60 seconds behind. We saw some donuts. That was the most exciting bit of the race for me. I always wonder whether they're going to stack it. The two Mercedes were doing donuts on the pitch straight, and I thought, you know what? They get all pretty close to each other, and then you've got this smoke curtain of just tyre and debris, not debris, but tyre rubber going off. There's smoke everywhere. I'm thinking, imagine their headlines if those two just clipped each other doing donuts. That'd be the last time you see donuts at any Grand Prix.
Let's be honest, it's Mercedes. They definitely have a donuts engine mode or a donuts button on the wheel because they know they're going to do it at the end of the season.
Yeah, they'll practice it in the simulator, surely.
Okay, Lewis, donut mode on. Donut mode on.
And hammer time.
Recharge off.
Yeah. Just it's typical Mercedes, perfect and everything, because once they finished those donuts, they were lined up perfectly facing each other. And I thought, you know what? That just summarizes that team. Two good-looking cars, the fastest cars on the grid for, the majority of races this year. And they've just perfectly aligned themselves at the end. Forget formation driving where they drive next to each other. That's step one. Step 100 is doing synchronized donuts and then facing each other at the end of the final race in the season. It just blows my mind how perfect it was. And it looked great as well. That was good PR for them because the cameras were on them. We missed Kevin doing some donuts as well. That would have been nice to see. Had a little donut party by himself going in through Sector 3. Last race in the car. Car's probably going to be binned off after this race because it's abysmal. Shame. It's always a shame to see a driver's last drive. We've seen it a couple of times this year. Roman will never drive in a race again, in Formula One at least. Kevin probably won't. There's a very slim chance for him. And, we don't know what's happening
I think
with
we
Perez.
know Kevin Magnussen is going to...
It's under a sports series, isn't he?
Yeah, he's going off somewhere else, so I doubt we'll see him in Formula One again. We could be seeing the end of Kvyat as well. That's possible.
Kvyat, blimey, and so many. Yeah, like I said, it's almost a bit sad at the end of this.
Lots
at
of
the end of the
movers
race
as well. Movers around the grid.
Lots of exciting movements. Obviously, we'll touch on that going in a later podcast. But yeah, bit of an emotional end to the year.
For the last time this season, then, let's take a look at our driver of the day in championship standings. Now, I think my driver of the day for this race is going to be Daniel Ricciardo. He had a great first stint on hards. He kept both McLarens away despite them being on fresher tyres after the virtual safety car and safety car, and then created enough of a gap on these tyres to not only keep setting personal bests, but also to come out of the pits in P7 and take the fastest lap during what was a very difficult weekend for Renault. He made up the most places out of the points finishes, I believe. So I think that he put in a really good shift for what was his last performance for Renault, and it just cemented why I can't wait to see that guy in a McLaren next year.
Yep, I agree. I'd actually picked out my driver of the day before I started the podcast, which is one of probably only 2 times that's happened this year. I'm going to work on it for next year. But Daniel Ricciardo, like you said, the performance wasn't there in the car. He had no right riding up in P5 all that time he did. And like you said, came out on a medium set of tyres, still didn't have the pace to catch up, but managed to set the fastest lap and just bring home a solid 7 points for the team. His last outing for Renault, like you said. And I just echo what you say again. I can't wait for him to be in that McLaren next year. It's just going to be him and Norris. The McLaren's a stronger car, so I expect potential podiums from Ricciardo. That might be a little bit much, given that they'll be switching engine supply. They may have some gremlins, but you never know.
It might be like the second fastest car on the grid. I mean,
it might be we can hope. We can hope. That's what. Yeah, you just don't know. It could change. Like next year is not going to be a static year. Lots of things are changing. Lots of new drivers. It's going to be great. Daniel Ricciardo was our driver of the day, and the actual driver of the day, was it Max Verstappen?
Yeah, he won the vote. Yeah. Which is fair enough.
Yeah,
he's like second place for me by a very close margin.
Yeah, he did a really good job in qualifying, took it to the Mercedes, and then led every single lap of the race, and almost had fastest lap as well. It was just a flawless performance from the Red Bull driver to finish off what has been a difficult year for him. I mean, he's had 5 DNFs this year, which I just want to highlight again. Like, if Verstappen's had 5 DNFs, if he had finished one of those races in the points, we would have seen him potentially in P2 in the driver's standings. And that's something that's big. That would have been embarrassing for, another driver.
Yeah, it's just a testament to his skill, and it's disappointing that we've seen so many DNFs, but also that, as I mentioned before, I feel like we've just not really seen him race properly with that many people like we did last season and in previous seasons.
I think the best is yet to come for Max. He's young, he's talented, he's got a lot of maturing to do, and that's not me saying that he's immature, but he's a mature driver. He's learned a lot over the last 5 or 6 years, backing out of oncoming incidents, getting out, not getting involved in as many discrepancies. It just goes to show that actually he can take himself so much further. Look how Hamilton and Vettel have changed over the last 10 years, and we're going to see exactly the same from Verstappen. And if that Red Bull becomes competitive, it's a future world champion.
Yeah, I'm just a little bit concerned that people have been saying that he's the future for 6 years, and it's not quite happened for him yet, and that's largely down to the machinery that he's had. That Red Bull has never quite been competitive enough to take him to a world championship, and we know that he is a driver of exceptional quality, and if he had competitive enough machinery, he could absolutely take it to
100%.
Lewis Hamilton and anybody else in any other car. So,
and I would love to see
he
that.
ends up in the right machinery.
I would love to see that. I'm a Hamilton fan, so I'm British. I support all the drivers, but I want to see people fight for the title. I want to see it to go down to the last wire, like the P3 did today in the constructors. I want to see the drivers' championship go down to the last race. That would make Abu Dhabi a little bit more entertaining than it was today. It's just the way it is. But obviously, Hamilton locked out the championship a while ago, and we've got Bottas, who secured P2 with 223 points, with Verstappen in P3 with 214 points. 9 points between them. 9 points between them, and Verstappen DNF'd 5 times this year. Man, that's crazy. That is absolutely crazy.
That's almost a little bit embarrassing, isn't it? As you mentioned before. So
I think that will. It wouldn't surprise me over the next week or two if we see that statistic being used in like publications quite a bit, because I know Bottas is, I think he's DNF'd once or twice this year, but that's a worrying sign for Mercedes. That actually they've got such a brilliant car that one of their drivers may not have finished second in the drivers' championship.
And they've got some serious quality waiting in the wings.
Oh, we know it. We already know that it's there, just standing by, waiting. Bless George Russell, didn't really get a word in this podcast.
Nothing to say. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
He was just stuck in that Williams, isn't he? I mean, can't compete, and this track is difficult enough as it is. So he qualified okay. He was still able to make the standard gap to his teammate, but like you say, didn't really get a look in.
It must have been hard going back to the Williams. It must have been harder to go back to the Williams than it would have been to go to the Mercedes, because you would have gone to the Mercedes and everything just worked. I'm not saying he didn't have to work hard, but everything worked a lot quicker. He could dial in that car a lot quicker because there's the personnel there, the machinery's there, the consistency's there, the data's there. And then taking all that, learning so much, coming off that high, and then going back into a Williams where you've got to live with those inconsistencies, and you're always thinking about, last week, or I did this at McLaren, I did this at Mercedes. It would have been more difficult to go back to that Williams than people make out to be. So a quiet week for George.
I think the only Williams on-track overtake today was Latifi getting past Magnussen.
Yeah, I think that's the only time I saw Williams on track.
That was about it, yeah. So, driver standings then. You already mentioned Verstappen getting very close to Bottas. Perez, despite his DNF, holds on to that fourth place, which is a great result. And
for a driver who's not in
25 points.
For a driver who's not in a season or not confirmed to be in F1 next year, it just baffles my mind. Just completely, just can't believe it.
Yeah, it's just, maybe just the wrong place at the wrong time. They just getting locked out at the wrong time.
Yeah.
Even if he's not in next season, I can't imagine him going away forever, because this shows his quality, and that car is good. It's clearly a good car. Sometimes it looks like one of the fastest, but he's put in performances of somebody who, has what I was going to say could fight for wins, but of course he has one.
He has one now.
He has his race win now, and it feels like he's a driver who, with the right machinery, can absolutely battle with the top drivers. So, at the very least, don't know what's going to happen, but if he does end up in that Red Bull, that's going to be very revealing of the Red Bull car, I think. I feel like it's going to be very revealing of their machinery if he struggles as well.
Could be a PR nightmare next year for Red Bull. I mean, I'm not saying that Perez is going to be a bad driver, but if it doesn't work, then there's questions to be asked there, because Perez is a proven race winner, which obviously Alex hasn't achieved thus far. Like you said, could be very revealing to that second car, or to both cars. You don't know what you don't know what's going on behind. Don't know what's going on behind closed doors. Moving on, so Perez, like you said, is sat comfortably in 125 points, with Ricciardo in P5, 119 points. Massive respect to Ricciardo for finishing ahead of both McLarens in points, but finishing behind in Constructor Championship, and that just goes to show that maybe Ocon wasn't up to, just didn't do what he needed to do this year. Ocon got 62 points and Ricciardo's on 100, almost 120, almost double. And we've seen that with some teammates this year. But it just goes to show, if you have two good drivers, I'm not saying that Ocon is a bad driver at all. I'm just saying that Ricciardo is a very good driver. Look what you can achieve. So fair play to Ricciardo for beating both of the McLaren drivers to P5 in the constructors, in the driver's standings.
Then we have Sainz in 6, equaling points with Albon. But Sainz finishes ahead because of his overall greater results, because he has that second place in Italy. So
whereas Albon only secured that third, right? So that's why.
Yeah, he's come third twice, but I think because Carlos has the second place, I think that puts him ahead, because he's had one position that was better.
That's good.
But it's a slightly more respectable finish for Albon. You mentioned about a teammate having half the number of points, but he has less than half the number of points as Max Verstappen. But he's managed to at least finish ahead of Leclerc, which is something. because if he'd finished behind Leclerc, which he could have done at this race, that might have been a little bit that might have been even more questionable than it already was. But you mentioned equal teammates. Norris in 9th with 97, only 8 points behind his teammates. So it shows, as you mentioned, when you've got that consistency between your teammates, then you can gather a more reliable number of points for the constructors overall as well.
I'm very much looking forward to next year when we've got Ricciardo and Norris. I know I've mentioned it about McLaren again, but seeing what Ricciardo can do with that McLaren, and whether, Norris and Sainz have done a fantastic job this year, but whether actually Ricciardo can extract anything more with his more experienced drive, with his previous experienced drives. He's a proven race winner. Whether we can really push that McLaren to new highs, that would be interesting to see how McLaren and how Norris and Ricciardo stack up next year. I have no idea which way it will go. I think Ricciardo will probably get the edge on Norris, and that's only through experience and stuff like that. But there's a lot to be excited for next year.
Yeah, let's take a look at the constructors then. Obviously, nothing to say at the top. 573 points for Mercedes as they close out the season. Absolutely dominant. Let's move down then. Red Bull, they are on 319. Still quite a deficit to have to overcome, but we've just touched on having teammates that are a bit closer together. Whoever it is that's in that seat next year, they've got to get a bit closer to Max Verstappen, because it's not just hurting Verstappen, it's hurting the whole team and their ability to really get close enough to Mercedes to get what we could actually call a title fight.
Yeah.
So, and that's not really been the case at any point this season. There's just been no doubt of Mercedes' dominance at all.
And fair play to Mercedes. They've just been flawless for the majority of the season. They really have.
Yeah, there's been no touching them. Right, let's come down to third place, where McLaren, they get their third place finish. From 9th in 2017, 6th in 2018. Perhaps even a little surprising, but nonetheless very respectable 4th last year. And then coming in third, you already mentioned the lack of Ferrari in those top spots helping out there. But yeah, that's the nature of the sport. I mean, Ferrari don't deserve to be in the top spots. So they've got to put in the quality and the performances.
Absolutely.
And McLaren have, and they've really turned things around in the last few years, and the changes in personnel have been excellent. And then they, obviously, I suppose I would say this, but they've thoroughly deserved it.
It's a beautiful story, and I can't wait in 10 years' time or in 15 years' time. Who knows what's going to happen in Formula One? But to look back at this era and look at that team go from not turning up to testing on time, to breaking down on testing, to having bits fall off their car, to finishing P3 in the Constructors' Championship. It's just incredible. It's a brilliant story, and I can't wait for a piece of work to be done around it, because it deserves to be highlighted, because that's how well they've done.
And it's McLaren Mercedes next season, not McLaren Renault. So that just compounds the excitement for next season and where they might end up. Just getting P3 again would be
a great achievement.
Damn good in my opinion. So.
Especially with a new engine as well. There's a lot of unknowns for McLaren going into next year. Different driver and obviously a different engine. It could throw things out. It could throw things out the pram. Out the window. You never know. But hopefully it goes the other way and it just starts to work.
Now, Racing Point, obviously, as we know, they end up 4th and Renault 5th. Ferrari managed a fairly respectable 131 points, but are still 6th, which is that's just not where Ferrari want to be at all. That is an awful season for them, despite a couple of promising results. And I'm afraid to say, Williams, they close out 2020 with 0.
Oh, I know.
Absolutely none. If there had been a full season, if we'd had all the normal tracks, would we have seen him? I have no idea. I wouldn't even know how to guess that one. But it's just a shame. Last season, obviously, they squeezed home a point in an unusual race from Kubica
in Germany.
Yeah. So it was good that they were able to squeeze that out, but they couldn't pull off the same result. And of course, tragically, they did have a pretty good chance with Russell in Imola, and it didn't happen as we covered in that episode. So.
Yeah.
Sad for Williams, but when you think of the progress that they've actually made on track,
absolutely,
it's still very promising.
It's not all doom and gloom for Williams, because obviously this year they've they sold their company name. I can't remember what they call it, but they've obviously got new investors now. Got enough money for next year, and for the next couple of years, they've maxed out what money they can use. Got new investors, so hopefully going in the right direction. They've still got that Mercedes engine in the back, so they just need to work on everything else. But everything else, and I know there's a lot to work on, but hopefully with the extra money and the investment, we can really see. I hope to see Williams go up like McLaren have. Which just might take a little bit longer because it wasn't too long ago when Williams were, scoring consistent points, and it's just a shame
when they
to
had
see
that
them.
Martini money.
Yeah, when they had that Martini money, and that brilliant livery as well. Like I loved it; it looked amazing. But we'll see. Next year's obviously a while away, and hopefully they can pull out all the stocks to secure maybe a point or two, maybe more, or maybe we'll have a repeat of this year and George will be on his way to Mercedes in 2022. You just don't know what's going to happen, but it's a shame. And Haas as well, to only score 3 points is just woeful. Like, it's so bad. Don't know what else to say about Haas.
Even worse after what was a poor season last season as well.
Yeah.
It's all seemed to be on a downward spiral, and they had all that controversy with Rich Energy, etc. And yeah, it only got worse this season. They weren't helped by obviously the poor state of the Ferrari power unit, but also they were struggling just in general. And I do see the logic with them wanting a big reset. I do understand that it kind of seems a bit unfair to get rid of 2 drivers where it probably wasn't really their fault that the way things were, but Haas are probably looking for a big reset into next season and indeed going forward into the regulation changes, because I think they were getting a bit of a negative reputation. Unfortunately, that might not be helped by Nikita Mazepin coming into their team.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
I have a feeling we're going to have a few conversations about that in future races. But
yeah, well, the controversy already
that's a tale
up
for another time.
Absolutely. And like you said, big reset for Haas going forward into next year. And I think this is just the first step into what hopefully is a lot of positive developments for that team. Getting 2 new drivers in, giving them a year in Formula One to really find their boots, understand the differences between F1 and the feeder series they've come to, get used to the car, get used to the engineers, the team, how the team operate, etc. And then have like a bit of a testing year next year, which I think a couple of teams will have a bit of a holding year next year, unfortunately, but we'll still have a good, if it's anything like this year, we'll still have a good, some very good races. And then obviously the reset in 2022 with 2 drivers then who have been on the grid for a year already, got that experience, and hopefully can change their luck. Well, there it is. We've wrapped up the final race of the year. It wasn't the most exciting race of all time, but nevertheless, it proved to be entertaining with the P3 standings and and McLaren securing that P3, which obviously we're both very happy about. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to give us a thumbs up on YouTube if you're watching, or consider subscribing as well. If you're listening on a podcast, then please do give us a rating. We get a couple every week, which is really nice to see, and it really gives us the motivation to keep on going, spurs us on to keep on making these podcasts. If you haven't done already and you have Twitter, be sure to follow us at RacePerMinute. We live tweet throughout the races. Alex chucks up a couple of memes, and we get, it's just, the interaction is fantastic, and we love hearing what you guys think on the races. And also, you get a chance to ask us some questions as well, which feature in our View from the Stands segment of the podcast. If you haven't got Twitter and still want to send in your question, then you can do by emailing us at info@raceperminute.com. You can send it in via text, or you can send us an audio clip, or you can record yourself and send it, and we'll pop your face on the video version of this podcast if you want. If not, don't worry, we'll just play your audio. It's completely up to you, but we just like hearing your questions, and it triggers some good conversations. Alex and I don't always agree on some things. It sparks some interesting debates, which is quite good. If you really enjoy the show and want to show your support, please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/RacePerMinute, where you can subscribe for as little as £1 a month and get benefits like joining our Discord team. And then as the tiers go higher, you'll get availability for some merchandise, which is coming soon. Alex, have you got anything else to say for the final time, for the final post-race discussion?
Just that thanks very much for joining us for this season so far. Obviously, we didn't start from the very beginning of the season. We started in Belgium. That was our first race, wasn't it? And I suppose it feels like this has been something of a trial period for us.
Yeah.
Because obviously I mean, I have a little bit of podcasting experience and, recording little bits and bobs, but doing it like this and doing Formula One and having the Twitter and engaging with people in that way, it's totally new to both of us, I think. And we've just been trying to find our footing. And thanks very much for being part of it and for spurring us on and helping the show be what it is. And hopefully we will see you again very soon, because we're not going anywhere. We're not just going to do nothing until the season starts up again. We've still got plenty to do, haven't we, Shane?
Yeah, we've got plenty of content coming. So if you are, most of it will probably be available on YouTube. We won't put anything too short on the podcast apps. But if you are interested in watching what we do in the off season, then subscribe to us on YouTube. You can find us by just typing in Race Per Minute, all one word. Like Alex said, we've got plenty of content coming, like a season review, driver review, and probably do like a team review as well. Haven't quite ironed out what we're going to do yet, but this is definitely not the last podcast of the year. So do stay in touch. And
we still have our virtual races. We've got our sprint championship to get through.
Absolutely,
and, you can rest assured that we'll be bringing all of the details as things get going again, including reactions to liveries. And we're going to take a look at pre-season testing as it happens and gear you up for the new season in 2021 as it comes. So thanks very much for being with us. And we hope that you'll stay with us too as we go into the new season.
Thank you very much. See you soon.